Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down and re-indigenize ourselves to the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we love to be alive in.
Grief is the willingness to be on that precipice between life and death, and to acknowledge this cycle that we're in, that everything we love we will lose. And if we really live that knowledge closely, then every moment feels like a gift.
For the first time, I have a return guest on the podcast, which happens to mark 2 years of the show. In this episode, I'm joined with Nici Harrison, who, since our first meeting, Birthing Drums with Dory Joy, and since our first podcast episode together, The Art of Grief Tending, back in November 2021, which is the first ever episode, I have taken part in one of Nici's online 3-month apprenticeship programs, and more recently we have worked together on one of her grief retreats this year, and we've become dear friends. We are now merging our work into an exciting new collaboration next year. Now, if you're completely new to the notion of grief tending, I encourage you to go all the way back and listen to our first episode, where Nici gives such a beautiful idea of what grief tending is and why it's so needed. Whereas in this episode, we dive into more nuanced topics, exploring how collective grief relates to our own sorrows and the psychedelic or liminal nature of deep grief and the relationship between grief and plant or fungi medicine ceremonies. This conversation will give you a sense of why we have formed this new partnership and a glimpse into the potential psilocybin has to support the tending of our grief. Nici is a beloved grief worker, speaker, and founder of the grief space. Through her own deep experiences of loss, she came to recognize that our modern culture has forgotten how to grieve. Over the years, Nici has been blessed to learn from great teachers, experience beautiful grief rituals, and familiarize herself with traditions and practices of tending to grief. Her work is built on the foundation that grief is sacred and is a radical gateway to a deeper appreciation of life. Here's Nici's words from our retreat page. Originating from the root word tenderness, grief tending invites us to bring compassion to our grief, as we would to a small child or a wild garden. Grief tending is the understanding that to be human is to know loss. It is the practice of welcoming grief so that we can keep our hearts open to life. It is coming home to the recognition that we all have grief, whether it's for the losses in our lives, the unmet longings, or the sorrows of the world. Grief tending is the understanding that our earth needs us to grieve, just as it needs us to pay attention. It is the trust that when we grieve and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we open ourselves to connection, authenticity, and intimacy. As we remember the lost art of grief tending where all is welcomed, we restore our connection to each other, ourselves, and the earth. We emerged with the capacity to hold it all, love and loss, grief and gratitude, life and death. The collaboration we are referring to is the mergence of our signature psilocybin retreat earth medicine with the art of grief tending. So in May next year, that's 2024, we are holding this first alchemized marriage of work that feels so naturally suited. So if you're curious and you would like to learn more, head to rootedhealing.org/earth medicine grief tending. The link will be in the show notes. Nici is also a special guest on our upcoming Deepen Your Roots, our year-long slow study, weaving deep ecology, the work that reconnects, and a folkloric animistic exploration into the ecological self rewoven with place. head to rooted.org/deepen to learn more and perhaps become a bioregional guardian, which is what will happen when you do this course. So it's been 2 glorious years of sharing these episodes with you all, and wow, it's been really nourishing to have your company on this path. If you're already a podcast patron, you will have access to a discount to mine and Nici's collaboration, Earth Medicine Grief Tending Gathering, to accompany this episode. Please do consider joining our humble Patreon community if you find value in this podcast. For example, I support For the Wild podcast because I don't spend money on newspapers or TV licenses or Sky channels or whatever. So I actively place value on the resources that enrich my path. And it is an honour and such a gift to feel your support, as I would love to carry this show forth with growing resource, as sometimes it's a bit of a struggle carving out the time. Later in the episode, I've woven in a beautiful song called Brave Ships by Ruth Blake, who I met at a recent dinner party, and a little shout out to the person who hosted that, a new friend carrying such needed work in educating women on our cycles, Laura Robson, who is an avid listener of this podcast. So just doing a little shout out to you, thank you. And I hope to have Laura on the podcast in the future. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Nici and find it as nourishing as I did. I'm really excited for this conversation because, well, it's been exactly 2 years since I released our other one, which is quite beautiful as a sort of marker for the podcast. It's had 2 years of existence. And that's also been 2 years since first learning about grief tending, which you introduced me to, and it's just been such a big piece of my understanding of myself and humanity and ceremony and everything in between. So it's such an honor to be leaning into collaborating with you with the grief space next year. And I'm really excited. I think this is very potent, a very potent mixing of worlds because they're so synonymous. I've got this quote from Francis Weller that you sent me. Today, the sources of loss are multiple, and the complexity of addressing this tangled web of grief can at times feel overwhelming. And he's also said, the personal and the planetary are inseparable, as is our healing. The interweaving of personal and planetary losses has left many of us feeling uncertain, anxious, and ultimately heartbroken. You've asked the question, how can we live and love in the face of loss, fear, and uncertainty? And I'd like to jump in and go to the despair of Gaza and think of, when we look at collective sorrows entangled over or through our own, what is the invitation when we speak of grief tending?
Yeah, it is a big question to begin with. And I think what I find interesting, just from the perspective of having done grief tending work for 6+ years now, at a time when it really wasn't written about, spoken about, and then I think what happened in 2020 with COVID and lockdown, grief was kind of starting to be a language that everyone was resonating with on some level. But I personally have not seen grief come to the forefront of the conversation in the way that it has done in the last 5 or 6 weeks since the events between Gaza and Israel, which have been going on for decades, so that's what I find curious at this time. I'm holding a lot of more grief tending spaces than normal. I've noticed that I've been invited to join other people's programs, so it's like curious to see the need grow. And I guess the question that I then come back to and sit with is, will these things have been going on and are going on in different parts of the world constantly? And yet it's kind of curious that this event, and yes, the numbers and the magnitude of it is what propels it into the forefront of our minds as it has done. But there's still something kind of underground and interesting that I feel is happening, which is like we cannot look away. What I feel that means for grief as a collective murmuring is this sense that it's coming, I don't want to say out of the shadows, because it's like so deeply in the shadow of our psyche, but it is kind of coming out of the, okay, I'm going to put that behind a closed door and not think about it because it doesn't relate directly to my everyday life. What I'd like to bring it back to is this idea of, that we all have heard of like, as within, so without. What's being brought up now in the collective around really looking at grief and loss is also this deep invitation to look and sit with ourselves and our own grief and our own stories that have gone untended to. And so at this time, as Francis Weller talks about, and I'm actually training with him again at the moment, is it is a time of overwhelming loss. And in the face of it, all we can do is be willing to look and to feel and to let it work us in a way that we become more willing to tend to our own sorrows, knowing that somehow that catches the thread of the collective. And as I say these words, there are many, many days recently where I question and doubt, how is me sitting in a grief circle supporting, to some degree, privileged people tend to sorrow, but very different to the horrors that are unfolding. And then every time I ask that question, it's like my head might question, but my body knows it's the only way. It's the only way is for us to each do our own grief work and to have that feeling of like it stops with me.
I've been struggling to wrap my mind and heart around it all, because there's been moments where the tears come and I'm just overwhelmed by the world and what exists within it sometimes. And then the next moment, there's such beauty. And it's holding the paradox. But how do we, the act of metabolizing it, the act of allowing it, I recognize a part of me that's like, no, I don't know if I have space to. I don't know if I can actually hold it in this moment. How do I keep my heart open and not crumble? I was going to add this quote from Francis Weller that he says, "We register in our psyches, consciously or not, the fact of our shared sorrows. Learning to welcome, hold, and metabolize these sorrows is the work of a lifetime." And so I'm also acknowledging, okay, I'm at the start of this journey.
And it's very complex and nuanced the way that I see it. For me, when I see people sharing and writing online about what one should be doing in response to what's happening right now, whether I agree, and often I do agree with what they're suggesting people do, but it's the separation from which the message is shared that kind of creates a knot in my belly that's like, no, this isn't the way. Because the number one thing in grief tending, like the foundation from which we do this work, is coming at it with this sense of tenderness. It's in the name, with this sense of self-compassion. And at a time when there is so much unfolding in the collective, there are going to be moments where it is way too much to be looking at and digesting and metabolizing. And so I feel like there is this sense of self-responsibility in knowing when it's really good for us and therefore good for the whole as well. It's like this dance, isn't it? To be in right relationship with not turning away and not flooding.
Mm.
Francis Weller talks about this a lot, that is actually his whole teaching, to build right relationship with grief, where we're not numbing out and we're also not letting it impact and move into every aspect of our lives. And I think with what's we're in danger of at the moment, it is feeling like we're a good person if we're letting it flood into our whole lives.
Mm.
But actually, that's not, as you describe in that quote, the work of the mature heart is to find a way through life that really allows us to feed it, but also allows us to live and be as well. And it's very difficult in our culture at the moment, I think, because that second point of not letting it flood and take over has layers of guilt and shame.
Mm.
So it's nuanced. It's nuanced.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that, because I also am getting a lot of knots in my stomach when I see the use of shame in people's rage and despair and their, whatever way they're trying to use voice, whether that's social media and beyond. It isn't my way, but I do appreciate where it comes from and why it's there.
We all have different parts to play. Yeah, I'm sure we've heard this in so many spaces, but even with the work of grief tending, there'll be those that need to rage and fight, and there are those that need to sit quietly and go to the woods and cry. And there are those that do the silent activism that no one ever sees. And then there are those that are using their grief to propel their leadership, to take voice and stage. And that's one of the things I come to in grief circles all the time is, let's please not let this be a space of comparison and judgment and hierarchy, because we all tend in different ways and at different times of our lives as well.
Yeah, that's poignant, because it just always comes back to, I don't even say the metaphor, this is just the law of life, but it comes back to the ecosystem. It's all needed. And I feel like we're more able to act from a place of community and connection and sharing in a way that we do orientate ourselves with acceptance, with a deep seat of compassion. This is how I'm feeling. This is what I feel I could do, or this is what I feel my capacity is. And there's no shame in all of those methods.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just share something more personal, if that feels okay. Yeah. I have a very beautiful mentor called Fiona Arrigo, and she once said to me, Nici, the work of your life is to break the generational patterns of my mum, who gave herself away constantly, burnt out, eventually to the point of deep depression, and as I've shared with you before, died by suicide. And Fiona said to me this message in such a way that I really got it, and it's my practice every day to try and remember it. She said, it doesn't matter how many grief circles you hold, how many retreats you offer, how many people that this message reaches, your actual job in this lifetime, it makes me cry now thinking about it, is to break that cycle of harm that, unintentionally and with so much beauty and grace and compassion towards my mum, who just did her absolute best, but it wasn't serving her and therefore wasn't serving the whole. And so I'm trying each and every day in this work to really come back to what I'm learning about metabolizing grief in a way that actually does the deep work, so that I'm living and embodying the change and not just like spinning it into a different form of the same type of harm. And I think it's a deeper, more subtle question that we could all sit with as these big events unfold globally, is, and what work do I need to do in my lifetime to let things stop with me.
Thank you for sharing that. That was literally what I was going to ask you about, actually. And more specifically, I kind of wanted to rewind time to that place you move through of such deep grief. I mean, I can only begin to imagine having experienced bereavement in other ways. When you were in that space, how did you interact with the collective grief? Did you have capacity at all?
No, I didn't. So my mum died in the summer of 2016, which was the year that we voted on Brexit, which is whether, we would leave the EU. And it was the year that Trump came in. And was there something else? See, forgive me, there probably was something glaringly obvious that happened that year. But I remember, saying to friends years later around a dinner table or something, oh, I didn't vote for Brexit. And of course, that was met with shock. And then when I explained, well, that was the summer that my mum had died. And I just didn't care, didn't think about it, wasn't plugged in, didn't have capacity. But I would even go as far to say as didn't care. I'm being generous on myself when I say, I didn't have capacity. But the truth is, when we have deep, deep personal losses and perhaps haven't had that sort of experience before, haven't come to build a relationship with grief. And at that point, I didn't even really have a relationship with death. So for me, my mum at that point was very much lost, and I would feel quite differently to that now. I wasn't really in the world. I look back, I have memory gaps from that time. I don't recognize myself in some pictures from that time. I was very, very numb and existing.
Yeah, even just making the next meal. I mean, and washing the dishes.
Yeah. I actually remember more physical, tangible tasks like that were okay. For me, and this is where everyone's so different and why it's so healing to have time to share your stories of grief. For me, I was more comfortable doing anything homely, anything that kept me indoors, anything that meant I didn't really have to, I was 23. So my world around me were finding jobs and moving to London and starting new relationships and just kind of being 23. And I felt most uncomfortable when I needed to do something that made me act like a normal 23-year-old. Being invited on a holiday with friends would send me into a panic attack. I paused my master's that I was doing. I didn't really want to do anything except hang out with my dad and exist, for probably 4 or 5 months. And I feel to name what a privilege, that was a privilege that I didn't have to rush back to work. I didn't have dependents. I didn't have many other roles in my life. I am in awe of the people that I sit with who are going through deep grief and also managing and navigating life and work around it. It's it's huge.
Yeah. Well, it's the depth of resilience of the human condition. It really is. Yeah, you've spoken of coming to the edge of what it means to be alive, which brings us back again to, well, I suppose what grief is really sistered with, which you speak about so often, and Frances Weller has talked about, grief and love. They are related.
I'm so glad that you reminded me of that, because actually it's easy to paint a brushstroke over those first sort of 6 months and describe how obviously difficult and agonizing it was. But when you said that line about being brought to the edge of being alive, I would also describe in some ways the early months of grief as something that I sort of miss because I do remember feeling alive, and I remember feeling this deep permission to be really close to my grief. every conversation that I had with friends or family was very deep and straight to the heart and nourishing in that way. And there was this kind of, as we've said, this word aliveness. I always laugh when you think about grief. People will, I don't know, maybe have quite a black and white picture of someone with like their head in their hands, but actually grief, particularly in the early months, years, it is a full kaleidoscope. It's quite, and obviously we're going to be going on to talk about psilocybin, so I don't use this word lightly, but it is a bit sort of liminal, and sometimes I would feel almost as if I was on a different level of consciousness and awareness during that time, in a way that wasn't always unpleasant. It was quite, it's almost like the body and the psyche are just so wise and they protect you. And I wasn't able to feel and cope with the immensity of grief. And so the body does something that allows you to exist in a way that you don't have to feel it all at once, but you can start to be in the world in this new reality. I say this all the time to people who come and say, I've been numb for years. And just to sit and thank the body for that, and to thank the wisdom of knowing that it was too much for it to feel all at once. And so this kind of liminal space that you might get taken to, or the different protection strategies. I love working with the protectors and really honoring and thanking them for being here in the ways that they look after us. But yeah, it's funny having this conversation and going back to that time, because it was a long time ago now, but there's a part of me that misses like going and just spending sort of the whole weekend with my dad in this really liminal, griefy, heightened, alive place.
Perhaps because it sort of cuts everything else away. The things that the noise and the busyness of our lives, it just brings it back to the skeleton, the bones.
Yeah, it's incredible how simple life becomes when we hone in on what's most important. And grief does that. That's what's so beautiful about when we allow grief to become this teacher in our lives, to really initiate us. It can help strip away everything that wasn't needed, everything that was serving something we are not. And it's not to put a silver lining around it. It's never, ever, ever what I'm about, but to welcome the possibility that within loss, there's always this deepening and this ripening. And it's one of my favorite yoga teachers says this, but it's so applicable. It's like, do not miss this moment. It's like, you're here, you're on your knees, you wouldn't have chosen it, but oh my goodness, since you're here, what is it revealing? What is it burning away?
Yeah.
Easier said than done. We need stewards and guides and people to hold that container for us. Otherwise we get lost down there.
Yeah, massively. I mean, maybe you can speak about those containers. Obviously, I came and facilitated on your most recent grief retreat, which was incredible. And that's really, we'd already discussed our partnership before then, but I really, in that space, was like, wow, this is so synonymous with the work with ceremony and psilocybin. And I guess the main difference in the group was that there was more bereavement, but there was still a variety of grief, a variety of pathways into that space to truly metabolize and process and heal and release, and you can see this softening that happens, this unfolding and this connecting. It's so deep and profound and magical. In fact, I want to bring in one of the poems you read during that retreat. Adrift, Mark, Nepo. Everything is beautiful and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad, and everything is beautiful.
I've never actually had somebody read that to me, which is really, yeah, thank you for that gift. It landed in a different way.
It speaks to that liminality you were talking to so beautifully.
Yeah, the liminality and the paradox, that paradox that we continue to come back to, that when we allow ourselves to grieve fully, we expand in all directions our capacity to love. And it's uncomfortable. And as you were reading that to me, actually, I felt this sense of how inconvenient it can be sometimes. We're going about our normal, ordinary lives, how inconvenient it can be to live with our hearts that wide open, to live with that feeling that we can, be looking for those that we love in the laugh of the next stranger, while also watching the birds hop from branch to branch, and also feeling this knot in our throat, but also looking at the way the light is falling through the fern. It's a beautiful reminder, and something that I feel I try and weave in. I mean, luckily this work takes me there like a catapult every time I sit with someone, so it's a gift to me as well. But I was with this morning, we're recording this on a Monday, and it's like, the agony and the effort it can take sometimes to allow ourselves to live at the edge with that much awareness. And that for me is the practice to not look away again and again and again. And I just sit here as you read that to me with the acknowledgement and the recognition of how difficult that is sometimes. And you mentioned a bit earlier this idea of containment and having a container to come into. And I think, I speak for myself. I know that I need to come back into circle again and again to be reminded and stewarded into remembering, oh yeah, I exist in my heart, and I can really expand my capacity to be with so many contradicting, polarizing magnitude of emotions. But it's not the way our world's set up at the moment. In order to get things done and move through life, if we had the layer of attention that poem asks for, I mean, what a beautiful existence, and what an unusual one right now. I guess for me, that's why I'm still doing this work 6 years later, never imagining that I would be. But it's because grief work takes me again and again, to keep quoting this poem, to that holiness that exists inside everything. It takes me there. It's like an arrow. It's almost like the fastest track I've found to keep coming back to this place. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to reflect on a poem that I so often read, because it's given me something. I mean, yeah, poetry is such a gateway and such a translator for things that we can't often explain and explore.
Yeah, it's something I had to come to terms with for myself, because I'm carrying the work with rooted healing, holding a lot of containers, that word, and just also acknowledging that to make that happen behind the scenes, I'm working really hard and I'm such a generator, I think is what I've been called in one of those human design or something. I will just keep going, keep going, keep going. And so I myself have to remember to land into circles and to land into spaces that are so tenderly, beautifully, cleverly crafted and held as that touch point, that inner compass, that resetting. In an ideal world, I would just stay there all the time in that space of balance and fullness. But yeah, these touch points are so nourishing, and then you can take it away into your life, and that's always so beautiful for me to hear people reflect their community's observations, months after they've left the space. That's when I think, okay, this is not just about these sort of peak touch point experiences. This is actually long-term work. This is really important.
Yeah, I just had this image of like throwing a pebble into a still lake and you get those ripples. It's not only that I have to believe, but I know that when somebody comes and shows up to the work, whether it's specifically a grief tending offering or the work that you do, as you say, it's never just for that single person's individual healing. That really is no such thing. But to know that they are going home changed and different, and will be showing up differently in their relationships and their work, and in just the everyday ordinariness of popping into town, and the way that they are communing and connecting with life around, that kind of joyful wonder of, okay, so 15 people come on a retreat and we have this beautiful time together, and of course there's the integration afterwards where we're checking in on each other and helping each other to land, and then there's the letting go and the trust that these people go into their lives. And for me, as somebody who's been through a lot of healing containers to get here, I suppose, I also know that it's never a straight easy road from there. We go in, we come back into our lives so changed often that we might need to change things. And so yeah, just to name that, particularly as we are talking about our retreats today, it's I never talk about these retreats saying they're going to fix, change, transform. They are a deeply healing and alchemical moment in our lives where we can pivot and come out with something quite different inside, but not necessarily know exactly what that is or know exactly how that's going to evolve into our external world. But when we show up for these spaces in this way, it's like they work us. We come in and we might have a specific intention, but then what arises in the space is so often that and more. People come for all different types of grief. Bereavement is kind of the obvious one when you've lost someone that you love, but people also come for the ends of relationships, for griefs that may have happened 10, 20 years ago, and created this sort of rocky ground from which there's a lot of decisions have been based on. More so people are coming to make sense of the climate crisis in their own hearts. But grief exists inside everything. And so what I notice is people might come having lost someone, and then within the course of the week together, they end up grieving parts of their childhood that they never had, or a longing and an expectation in their life that hasn't come to fruition yet, or often what happens is the longing and the loss for being in circle. So and so what the retreats are so beautiful for is they create this kind of temporary village that is so deeply nourishing, as you said, that you feel so topped up that these griefs, these longings that we've had actually feel safe enough to come to the surface, because for the first time they might actually be met with acknowledgement and witnessing. Yeah, and each time it's just so different. I love the absolute beauty and magic of the groups that constellate together, and the ways that there are similarities, and the healing happens between the people who come are such deep medicine for each other. And of course, we, through the different retreats, there's a structure, and that's really important. I have learned grief tending from my teachers here in the UK, namely Sophie Banks and Jules Wingfield, and then I've done a lot with Frances Weller, who's based out in America. And there is a structure and a holding and a container that allows people to drop, but then there's a lot of mystery that comes through. Within that, there's an acknowledgement of the different practices that help us to open. So in grief tending, we talk about the need to stir and release, because we have so many layers of protection sometimes that we do need to come into a place that can stir our grief enough for us to feel. So those will be a mixture of movement, embodiment, more kind of emotional inquiry, journaling. It's
breath work.
breath work. Yeah, your beautiful breath work ceremony. So a real, alchemy. I call the retreats the sort of signature grief space retreats are called grief alchemy for that reason. It's a real blend. I also run a lot of things online, and the potency of that continues to surprise me. And then, of course, there's our collaboration, which is, it feels like for me as an individual, this seed has been planted for a good few years, just knowing within myself how psilocybin and the medicine has changed my relationship with grief and my own journey, and knowing that at some point, because everything I do at the grief space is about continuing to offer the things that have been gifted to me, I knew that there would come a time where I need to talk about it, or collaborate, or share in some ways the kind of weaving of the magic of that.
I mean, you planted the seed because you had a dream.
Yeah, and I just had this feeling of being with you in ceremony and wanting to learn from you, actually. I don't know if we ever shared much about this, but feeling this kind of complementary sisterhood and in such deep reverence to your depth as a medicine woman, really, and the way that you hold space with your voice and your connection to, again, I want to use the word spirit, and just had this feeling of, yeah, I need to be there with Ronnie in circle. The feeling I remember most was, I need to learn from you.
Wow.
I love that we're talking about this for the first time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think as I reflect on it now, that still rings true. I think what's so beautiful about the way that we weave together is we have different experiences and teachers and paths that have brought us here to a place where we're doing very, very similar heart-centered work, but with different practices and skills to be able to hold groups in different ways. And the depth that you've journeyed with psilocybin brings me such a sense of trust and reverence. And so, yeah, here we are, feeling our way into offering psilocybin ceremony and grief tending side by side, which feels so natural. Yeah, and at the same time, it's like ancient and new.
Yeah.
Ancient and new.
Yeah, I love this. This feels very intimate for the podcast. Well, thank you. I don't know how I feel about being called a medicine woman. I feel like I need some more wrinkles to start fully encapsulating what that actually means.
You
But
could be a
yeah, I'd
medicine
love,
maiden.
yeah, medicine maiden. I like that. Yeah. And I do think if I do go through the initiation to motherhood, that will also completely change everything as well. That's interesting, just thinking about maidenhood. I want to understand a little bit more about how the medicines assisted you with your grief.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, feeling the sweetness of the intimacy of this conversation. Not some I have not spoken about this publicly, semi-publicly. My first experience with plant medicine was actually with ayahuasca 4 years ago. Yeah, I was very fortunate to get this opportunity to travel with a friend to Peru. And we sat in ceremony. We did 5 ceremonies. We were there for
Mm,
10 days. And so I feel very grateful that having not even really experimented on my own very much before then, so to kind of move into the plant medicine world in this way was so beautiful because I was immediately shown how to hold such a deep reverence
mm,
for these teachers. And so from the very first moment, my relationship with these medicines has been like meeting the great mother of the earth. And um, like all these things, for anyone who knows, so difficult to actually put into words.
mm,
But within that week, I had a very, very deep understanding of my mum's depression, of
mm,
where it came from, of what it felt like,
mm,
of what it felt like for me to be her child,
mm,
as young as in the womb. I had a much deeper understanding of how her depression was not personal, but was so embedded to our collective ill
mm,
health. And therefore, I had so much more forgiveness and love. Also, from that same time, it became very, very clear that the world needed grief work,
mm,
and a very clear understanding that it was not about me, which
mm,
has really helped in this world of trying to build a business and all of
mm,
that. It's given me that confidence constantly to just get the message out there, no matter how many times I do it imperfectly. And it, my experience with the medicine gave me, for the first time in my life, an embodied feeling that I belonged.
mm,
I haven't sat with ayahuasca since. I don't, to be honest, for me, think I will again. It's very, very strong.
mm,
But what I did do is come home and start working with psilocybin. And so in the last 4 years, I would say maybe like once every 6 months,
mm,
I've gone to an intentional psilocybin ceremony. In some ways, they've always been an extension of that same very, very potent experience for me. I found working with psilocybin more gentle.
mhm.
I have another teacher who would call them the holy children. I don't know how
Yeah.
universal that is. Yeah, same. The reason it's been so beautiful for, I would say, twofold, for my own grief that is, in large part connected to my mum, but I also have, other personal griefs going on from, a big relationship breakup that I went through last year, to leaving a city that I loved, a job that kept me quite stable, certain friendships that
Mm,
I feel for whatever reason don't seem to be working in the same way. There are layers and layers of grief as I've deepened and changed into the woman I am today. Um, and sitting in psilocybin ceremony is often a deep anchor into letting go of what is not meant for me, and feeling a greater sense of love and support from the earth and everything that we cannot see for all that I am doing. And I think for someone who's like me, who's lost their physical mother, tuning into the great mother and feeling her wisdom is such a tonic. It's like a lifeline, really. Yeah, I mean, it prompts me actually to ask you, if that's okay, what your connection with psilocybin and grief specifically has been. And I know it was a big moment for you a couple of years ago when the concept of grief tending landed. I'm also conscious that you are probably someone who's been grief tending for many, many, many years, but not realizing it was called that. And just, yeah, how the two have woven for you.
Yeah. I think similarly, the process you speak of being able to inhabit your mother's experience and your experience within her womb and as a child, and the collective experience, I've definitely had that through ceremony and through the medicines. My first encounter was with ayahuasca, and my teachers are medicine keepers of the Red Road lineage and tradition, so ayahuasca, San Pedro. And it's funny, I went into that first ceremony with ayahuasca. I wanted to find my inner strength because I'd been so weighted down by overwhelm and grief and anxiety and chronic disease. And I really was lost living in London and trying to fit into a certain mold. And the first thing I felt was, on a very somatic level, this feeling of profound love move through my veins and particularly enter the areas that have been difficult for me. So I've had, a thyroid condition, so I felt it going into my throat and into my heart. And I wasn't having crazy visuals or anything like that, but it was just this powerful presence. And it's funny, I've not spoken about this on the podcast because I catch myself with these stories, because there's a lot in the psychedelic community of stories of ceremony. And I think there's also a lot of, a lack of integration and so on and so forth. So I've almost sort of self-contained it. But yeah, I just wept. I wept because I felt held, I felt seen, I felt loved, I felt like there was a spirit or a beyondness that was healing me. And through that healing of self, I felt, the whole line, the whole line going back in time. And it is pretty ineffable, and it's hard to encapsulate these things. But similar moments will happen. And I echo what you say, that psilocybin is a much more gentle medicine. And I think people sometimes hear gentle and think weaker. No, I say, the children, these holy children, Niños Santos, they can be so truthful. They can be very blunt, actually. If you've got a spot on your face, a child can say, "What's that big spot on your face?" Yeah. And so there is this real actual, they can be strong and difficult and challenging. And at the same time, wow, can they activate our childlike wonder and take us through into our inner child. That's why I do a lot of inner child work before our first ceremony. I think it's so important, we're all the patterns that we're carrying really are from those early days. That connection with our parents or our guardians can be the source of huge grief. And so, I can speak also to the last encounter I had with psilocybin, which was to try the medicine we'll be working with in Portugal, with a lovely grower who grows only for ceremonial use. And I hadn't tried this type before, so I made a little ceremony for myself and my partner, and was just finally allowed to be with my grief that I had been, I don't know where I put it. I really don't know where I put it. But last winter, I had one of the hardest challenges I've ever had to face. It was harder than having cancer. It was harder than losing a friend. I had a terrible fallout with my mother and stepdad. It was absolutely horrible. I was completely in shock. I felt the same level of shock that you feel when you lose someone. Yeah, I couldn't believe. I thought, what I'm doing all of this work, and I'm creating such community in my life. And my own mother, before my 30th birthday, 10 years after having cancer. So I did actually want to celebrate that birthday as a sort of also a 10 years on from cancer. Couldn't have me in her home. What it comes down to is they hold immense fear for the work I'm carrying. Immense, immense fear. And that's a big space for grief that I had to process there now, with the psilocybin, meeting the medicine, asking for permission. Can I work with you on this land? Asking the land for permission, asking the farmer who owns the land for permission, asking myself, does this feel right? And also holding the deep grief I feel for not being witnessed and not being understood by my mum. And it, just being able to feel it, being able to weep, but also through the tears moving, being able to journey to the deep place of empathy and understanding for her and my stepdad, who's only come into the scene more recently, I should probably add for context. And really, that's something I feel the medicines, the psilocybin does for us. We can hold the pain that we're already experiencing, but we're able to understand from a seat of much deeper compassion and wisdom that we can't usually access in the current age, I think. All the other pieces of that puzzle, to understand their pain, their wounds, their traumas, their needs, and to see it all connected at once and to feel it all. And wow, so much feeling. And at the same time, it's utterly beautiful somehow. It's like, oh, this is life. This is it. I am doing it. I'm feeling it. And I welcome it, actually. And so that's my long answer of my relationship between psilocybin and grief. It allows the doorway to open more widely into life, into the edge of being alive, to use your words.
Thank you for sharing. Really, really honoring your courage and honoring the ways that you put language to how grief is so much more than just as simple as when we've lost somebody directly through a death. It's sometimes even harder and deeper and more painful to understand and share. You say, just had this feeling of, wanting to wrap my arms around you last winter, and knowing as well that this is why you're able to hold the work that you do, because you go to these places within yourself. Yeah, I love what you said about how the medicine, specifically psilocybin, gives us this deep gift of being able to really feel our own loss and joy. It's like it does full spectrum. But also is this sense of perspective of how others might be feeling and relating. And I guess that just takes us back to the whole image of the mycelial network and how we're all connected and ebbing and flowing and lighting up. And I guess maybe that brings me to to why it's so beautiful to come and do particularly psilocybin work, but also the grief work, very much so in community and in groups and in spaces with, often people that we've not met before that week. But I can speak for myself, like coming into these spaces over and over again, although group work has its own challenge for some people, I found that by stepping into a space where I've been surprised and amused by the different relationships I create with people similar to me, completely different to me, it embeds something in my psyche that now if I just go out, in an everyday trip to town, I kind of have this deep knowing that, okay, this stranger is probably way more similar to me than I realize as well. Because once we've had that experience enough times of being in ceremony, of being in a village, of being in a circle, it changes our way of interacting with all. Yeah, I guess I'm curious what your experiences of having experiences with psilocybin, maybe kind of more individually or in a very small group, and then what it's like to come together on one of your retreats. And I guess particularly if we weave grief into that, how that might flow.
Well, I feel like the more I do this work, all of the different threads of facilitation I carry forth, it really is the art of cultivating something in the space that is totally a co-creation. And there's a tactility almost to the air, And so I really think it's the art of togetherness that carries this work, because psilocybin outside of that art, absolutely powerful. I mean, the science research is showing in clinical trials, one-on-one, it's showing the magic still happens. And even to the extent that psilocybin is substantially more reliable in increasing nature connectedness, even if it's being administered in a clinical setting, which I find really interesting. But I personally find it very hard to not be held. So that ceremony I spoke of with my partner, that was a challenging encounter with psilocybin. It was strong medicine, and not having someone hold me meant I had to hold myself. And I'm really good at that. I can do it, but you go into a different mode to really be held, to really have someone sing their heart through into lyric or into sound and create a soundscape, and to be there and to pray in whatever capacity that prayer exists for them. For most people in ceremony spaces, their songs are their prayers. That's where I feel I'm able to fully go in deep. The group setting for me, that little village you spoke of, that's the magic. And you see it in people's testimonials and in the integration afterwards. And again, coming back to something you spoke to, that art of letting go is really hard. I find very maternal instincts come in because we've created this village. And at some point you do just have to trust those seeds are planted, and that you've provided as many tools, and holding as much as you can and trusting that those ripples will continue to unfurl. So I find that through the group work, it's so multi-dimensional. The psilocybin is one component. It's not even the highlight in many ways. Many people will say, actually, it was the breath work that I had access to, something I've been looking for so long. Or it was the village. It was being able to be so authentically myself and feel so seen and heard that it just changes people. And bonus, the psilocybin might completely change how you think and perceive the world. You look at Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic fields and resonance. And I won't go into it, but there's something that science is missing, I think, about the memory of habits, or the memory, the kind of essence that's created throughout lives and lineages. And I think when we step into ceremonial containers, and this is why I do really believe in the power of lineage, which I can speak more to. It's a big topic, deserves its whole own podcast probably. There's a familiarity not only to the indigenous psyche, but to, I think, spirit and to land and to the trees that are cocooning the space. And there's some sort of agreement that takes place that this is healing work, this is intentional work, and it creates a totally different experience to a potentially more challenging situation in a recreational setting. Not that I shun recreational encounters with psilocybin, because I think psilocybin does actually carry a very nymph-like essence and quality, and a lot can be discovered through the permission of play and the permission of curiosity and childlike wonder.
It almost brings us in some ways full circle to the poem. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. And I think I hadn't kind of made that connection until just now of actually that's the duet of doing the psilocybin work with the grief work. Is yes, there's this beautiful permission that happens and access. I think that's one of the things that psilocybin medicine offers me, is fast access to whatever needs to be felt. But then also, as you said, this kind of wonder-like quality is enlightened, that one of my teachers will talk about like two wings of the bird, how we need to have one wing in grief and the other in praise. And what a beautiful way to invite in both of those wings, explorations in equal measure, than sitting with the medicine that does both of those so organically as well.
There's a piece that John O'Donoghue's written that I use a lot in our integration materials, because we guide people through a compass for life, and it's the 3 R's. It's relationship, self, other, world, cosmos, everything, our relationships. Reverence, the cultivation of reverence, which is really what we're speaking to as well. And then reciprocity, which again sort of loops back into relationships, a bit of a circle. But there's something that John O'Donoghue's written, I'm just going to read it. What you encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree on the quality of your approach. Many of the ancient cultures practice careful rituals of approach. An encounter of depth and spirit was preceded by careful preparation. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. Our real life comes to the surface, and its light awakens the concealed beauty in things. When we walk on the earth with reverence, beauty will decide to trust us. The rushed heart and arrogant mind lack the gentleness and patience to enter that embrace. It just says it so perfectly. That's what ceremony is about. And that's what that art of togetherness, creating that reverence together, so potent. Thank you, psilocybin, because we've forgotten how to do that in modern culture.
And then it's about, and this is why, I know that you do integration work so beautifully. It's a big reason that I feel so in deep trust with our collaboration, actually, is helping people to realize that sense of wonder and that beauty of approach that you just speak to, that we have cultivated and practiced in the retreat. It's about bringing that home to our absolutely ordinary life on a Monday morning when it's grey and rainy and we're sitting down to do whatever chore needs to be done. It's allowing that way of being to just permeate, so that every single ordinary moment has the potential to become extraordinary when we pay attention. And again, I'm finding all these beautiful similarities, because that for me was what grief work has given me, is this gateway. Ultimately, grief is the willingness to be on that precipice between life and death. And to acknowledge this cycle that we're in, that everything we love we will lose. And if we really live that knowledge closely, then every moment feels like a gift. Again, we just keep coming back to the same thing, but that's why it stretches our hearts so wide open when we come into this work.
Hey, when we started out, yeah, we were all sweet, innocent, and bright, yeah. Hey, now we're coming back around, yeah. Dragons on the wave singed a few hairs. Sometimes, you know, I lose sight, yeah, of all of you other ships braving the night, yeah. Sometimes, you know, I get scared, yeah, of reaching for a hand to find it's not there yet. Reaching for a hand to find it's not there. Hold on, waves are coming in. Stand firm, waves will come, another one and another one. Hold strong, mighty souls were born for storms like these. For storms like these. Remembering, hey, when we started out, yeah, we were all sweet, innocent, and bright, yeah. And hey, now we're coming back around, hey, yeah. We're ragged at the edges, dragged back through it. Sometimes, you know, I lose sight, yeah, of all of you other ships braving the night, yeah. And sometimes, you know, I get scared, yeah, of reaching for a hand to find it's not there yet. Reaching for a hand to find it's not there. Hold on, waves are coming in. Stand firm, waves will come, another one and another one. Hold strong, mighty souls were born for storms like these. For storms like these. So remember your soul. Remember your soul. Remember who you are and why you came. Remember who you are, oh, remember your soul. And though we always do our best, but it never seems to be enough, and we're losing everything. And everything's so hard, wading through the dark parts of the heart, still we're losing everything. And God, it's such a mess, so much suffering, feels like I'm trying to bail us out with a teaspoon. But it's not just me, there's a whole fleet coming up behind, and it's what we're here for. No, it's not just me, there's a whole fleet coming up behind, and it's what we're built for. Cause if the ocean was calm every day, you would never find the courage of the man who was drowning. If you never burnt down to the ground, you could never rise up from the ashes you were down in. If you wanna know more, push up from the shore without the promise of a happy ending. If you wanna know love, bow down to the shadow of the truth that you've been defending. If you wanna know love, bow down to the shadow of the truth that you've been defending. If you wanna know love, just do what you do. Just be what you are, imperfectly you. It's the world you were meant for.
I have a poem that I wrote not too long after my friend George died, which I spoke about in our last episode. And it's also speaking to that relationship between death and life and that liminal threshold. And I'm just going to read it. I'm just going to do it. Life is too short, they say. This pressure to be present, linear, fluorescent. It won't be long before he's taken away. I've known deep down, just like I felt with my friends who died before turning 25. It scares me who my body decides is precious. This sixth sense, perhaps it's no power of mine, only a soft knowing by them, that unfolds through their eyes in telling peaceful perspective. Attracting me like a mayfly to the damp dawn, I flutter above their calm, cool waters. Silently apprehending the splash and struggle, yet I keep dipping, testing, daring myself in. And now floating, half soaked on the surface, I wonder, what should I do with my gift? These precious days granted to some, taken away from many. And if grief is an art to be practiced like this, a heart pulled, squeezed, torn, a twist for a kiss with death, then distancing myself goes against every current that's left. My skin breathing and yearning, addicted to deeper understanding. Shining, he cinders a knowing smile, two voids apart for only a short while. We're all one after all, rise and fall, rise and fall. I'll keep our secrets woven into this spiraling story. And just like the vibrations of the gong, dissolving, I'll join your cool, calm waters, for I know it won't be long.
Wow, goosebumps.
Some of it's probably a little abstract, but it was after a phone call I had with a friend who's also died young from cancer. From when you have cancer when you're young and then you do things with charities, you then make lots of lovely friends who also have cancer. So I'd spoken to him and he said it was getting worse. And that poem was after that, after already losing George. And just trying to process young death.
I mean, what medicine at this time? We started this conversation talking about what's going on in Gaza and the atrocities that are unfolding. So thank you for the gift of those words. And yeah, there are definitely certain images from that poem and just feelings that I got in my body that have really awakened and touched something. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been so beautiful. I feel so nourished. I always do from our time together. It's so nourishing, and I feel truly blessed to, be going towards next year, knowing that this is in the calendar and this merging of our work and our passion, and also what you spoke to earlier, the fact that it's not about us. It's about everything else that's being co-created. So I love that.
I think what I'm getting so much from having sat here with you again is this reminder that none of what we're doing here is trying to fix anything. And I'll often say this to others: imagine that I'm just going to hold your hand and sit in the mud with you as long as you need until you want to get back up. And I love that when we come together, my hope, we will invite this sense of, come and join us here. I think of the Rumi poem, out in the field, I'll meet you there, no right, no wrong. And we will contemplate together, and we will hold space for exploration and a softening. And I have the absolute trust that when we do that and we show up in that way with ourselves, it just creates the permission for anybody that chooses to come and be with us to find that sense of being their own medicine in their own way. And that's again, the reciprocity of that is the relief and the permission that reverberates back into me, that I can just be my own medicine. And very, very grateful. Again, I kind of forgot we were even recording. Just love this. So Yeah, very, very grateful to be here, and just in total trust and admiration and joy, really, to be bringing this psilocybin and grief work together.
Hold on, waves are coming in. Stand firm, waves will come, another one and another one. Hold strong, mighty souls were born for storms like these.
Through deepened imagination, consciousness expansion, and cross-cultural wisdom exchange, we explore human soul ecology to ignite collective healing, nature awe, and interconnectivity. We offer nature-immersive ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, integrative healing courses, and a growing collection of resources. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. Please do consider joining our Patreon community, where you can gift forward and support our work in exchange for bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution, which can be as little as £2 a month, helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough gifting community to really go the extra mile with this show and its purpose. Come follow us on Instagram at Rooted Healing Co, or find us on the various platforms you tune into. And don't forget to rate and review the show if these stories and conversations are touching you. It's a beautiful act of reciprocity. Thank you. The music in this episode was by Mike Howe and Ruth Blake. You can find their links in the show notes. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.